Hi, my name is Sarah Seddon. I'm the liaison librarian for the Education Department at LMU. Today, I am going to be giving a presentation about how to find and evaluate sources for a paper. So, by the end of this presentation, I am going to answer three questions. Number one, where do you go to search for the information you want? Number two, once you know where to go to search for it, how do you find the information? And finally, how do you determine if the information you find is right for your paper? So, before you even begin to search, the first step you should take is to check your map. And when you are writing a paper, your map is the rubric that comes with your assignment. So, when you're looking at your rubric, there are two pieces of very important information you want to look for. Number one is how many sources does your professor require for your paper? And number two, what kind of sources does your professor require? Some professors are very particular about the type of sources they want you to have in a paper. They may want you to have, for example, two primary sources, or they may want you to have five peer-reviewed articles. It's going to change from paper to paper. So let's talk about this. What is a primary source? What does it mean if a source is peer-reviewed or not? So, to answer the first question, you usually have sources categorized into either a primary source or a secondary source. Primary sources are original materials. They're usually something that is written at the time that an event is happening. They're not looking back at something that happened in the past. They're not interpreting the information or evaluating it. They are just writing it as it is happening. And it's almost always the very first appearance of information, regardless of the format. Because a primary source can be in any format. It can be written, it can be photographic, it can be filmed interview and audio recording. So, an example of a primary source, let's say you want to write a paper about the desegregation of schools in America. A primary source would be, for example, a newspaper article that was written at the time that Ruby Bridges began to go to an all-white school. So that would be a primary source. A secondary source, on the other hand, is something that looks backwards. It's not original material, it's usually commentary on original material. So it might be evaluating or reviewing, it may be discussing something that happened in the past. It's always looking back with 2020 hindsight, the way it is interpreting the events or the information through a modern lens rather than the way people would have been thinking at the time something was happening. So, going back to the subject of desegregating schools, an example of a secondary source might be an interview with Ruby Bridges now, where she's talking about her memories of being the first Black girl at an all-white school and what that was like. So, even though it's her memories, because she is looking back with many years between now and the time the event happened, it makes it a secondary source because now she's got all these years of experience and it's changing the way she is looking at the events at that time, and it just changes everything. So that's the difference between a primary and a secondary source. Now, what is a peer-reviewed source? So a peer-reviewed source versus a popular source. So your professors may ask you to get an academic article or a scholarly article for your paper. And those all mean the same thing. Academic, scholarly, refereed, peer-reviewed, these are all the same thing, just different words. So the biggest difference between peer-reviewed and popular articles is the publishing process they go through. So with a peer-reviewed article, the process is extensive. You don't just submit your article and hope that it gets published. It's going to go through this multi-step process where you may or may not be getting that paper published because the journal that is publishing it is much more careful about making sure that it is publishing information information that is accurate, that the information is important and it's saying something new. And the way it works is a scholar will write their paper, they'll submit it to the publisher, and then the publisher hands this paper over to a handful of selected experts. Usually these are renowned subject experts. They may be professors in the field who have had decades of experience. I mean, they are looking for people who will know that the information is good or not. And these peer reviewers take the time to read through the article. They're looking for things like, is the information accurate? Are they talking about this topic in a way that makes sense? Are they saying something new? Is it going to be important? There's a whole laundry list of questions they're asking themselves as they read the paper. And then they make all this commentary on it. They suggest changes. And then if they do suggest changes, before the paper can get published, the writer has to make those changes. Oftentimes, the paper will go through several rounds of this process where it's back and forth between them and the peer reviewers, trying to get the paper into the kind of shape it needs to be in to get published. And you have papers that go through several rounds of this process, and in the end, they don't get selected. It just doesn't work out. Whereas the ones that do get selected, they've been through this very vigorous process. So while the information isn't 100% guaranteed to be accurate, it has a much higher chance of being accurate than, say, somebody's blog post, where there's nobody checking the information in it before it gets published onto the internet. And when we're talking about popular sources, we're talking things that are more like magazines or a news website on the internet. Popular sources don't go through nearly as extensive of a vetting process that peer-reviewed sources do. And in addition to that, they also have different goals in mind. So, like the news, they do care about the information being accurate, but they also really care about what is going to sell. And so, rather than it being about publishing necessarily new information that's important, they're looking at information that is entertaining and popular, something that is going to sell. And so, it's just a very different process in selecting what articles get published. So when you are looking through these different types of journals, you're going to notice a very big difference, like in their physical appearance, a lot of times. Usually, with a peer-reviewed source, it is very plain in appearance, whereas popular magazines are glossy. They've got lots of photos that are meant to attract the eye. And then, if you actually open them up, you'll see a really nice table of contents in an academic journal, which you may or may not have in a magazine. Magazines are also going to be full of advertisements for watches, perfumes, a lot of fashion items. An academic journal isn't going to have any of those type of advertisements. If it has any advertisements, it's probably going to be a call for submissions, for paper submissions, or it might be an advertisement for some scholarly conference that's coming up. They're not going to be any advertisements for fashion of any kind. The other big difference is with academic journals. If you look at the end of each article that's in the journal, you're going to see pages of citations. Not so much in a popular magazine. The most you might say is in the body of the article. It might say something like, so and so is quoted as saying blah, 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 blah. There's not actually going to be any sort of reference you can look at that'll give you information to find where they got that information from. You're just kind of taking the author at their word. Whereas academic article, you will actually be able to use that information to find every single paper or book or whatever they cited. So it's a very different appearance. So here is an example of a popular magazine versus an academic journal. As you can see at a glance, they're very distinguishable from each other. That said, you can't go based on appearances all the time. If you look at this next example, we have two very similar looking covers. If you asked me at a glance, I would probably say they're both two popular magazines, but that's not the case. One of these is an academic journal and the other is not. Similarly, we have these two covers. Again, I might have thought they were both the same, that they were both scholarly journals. But again, that is not the case. One of these is a popular magazine. So, since you can't always go based on appearances, how do you find out which one is which? Well, the library has a wonderful resource that you have free access to. It's called Ulrich's Web. So, let me show you Ulrich's. We are going to go to the library website. This is library.lmunet.edu. This is our main page, and if you look right under the search bar, you'll see this nice big button. It's called Databases A to Z. So we're going to click on that. That's going to bring us to our database list. Now, I know that Ulrich starts with a U, so I'm going to click on the U here, narrow it down, and scroll down until I find Ulrich's periodical directory. I'm going to click on that, and this will bring up the database. So, now I'm going to do a quick search. So let's go with the first one, Scientific American. The main thing I want you to pay attention to is this black box right here. And when I hover my mouse over it, you'll see that it says refereed. So remember, refereed means peer-reviewed, academic, scholarly, they're all the same thing. So basically, any of the titles in this list that have a black box next to it, that means it is a peer-reviewed journal. Now, if we look at the top here, Scientific American, none have the black box next to them. So that tells me Scientific American is not a peer-reviewed or scholarly journal. Whereas if I look for Science, here we go. There's Science right there, and it has the black box. So Science is the peer-reviewed article, and Scientific American is not. So Adult Education Quarterly. There's the black box right next to it, so that means it is peer-reviewed. Whereas American Educator, no black box, so not peer-reviewed. So if you're looking at various sources and you're not sure if it's peer-reviewed or not, just go to the Ulrich's database, type in the title, and see if it has that black box next to it or not. That will tell you for certain whether you are looking at a peer-reviewed source or not. Okay, so now you know more about what types of sources are out there that you may need for your paper, and you also know how to distinguish between them a little better. Your next step is going to actually be figuring out where to go to get the information you want. So you're going to shop around a bit. So there's lots of different options available to you. Number one being the library. We have so many resources here at the library. We have books, both physical and digital. We've got tons of academic journals, again, both physical and digital. We have access to over 260 databases, and then we have the librarians themselves. We are basically your human search engines. If you are struggling to find sources for a paper, you should hit one of us up. We would be happy to help you find them. You can call or email or just walk in and ask to make an appointment with a librarian, and we will actually sit down one-on-one with you and help you find the sources you need. So, like I said, if you're having trouble, please come by the library and ask for help. We will be more than happy to do that. So let's talk a little bit more about the databases. One thing I want to point out, if you go to the drop-down box that says all subjects, you can select education from the list. And so instead of looking at a giant list of 260 databases, you're now narrowed down to less than 50 that are all considered important to the subject of education. The other thing I want to point out is this yellow box at the top. So All of these databases in the yellow box are considered the best databases for this particular subject area. So if you're trying to decide where to go, start here. Look at one of these databases that's in the yellow box in the education subheading, and you're going to have a really good chance of finding something that is useful to you. Your next option, so let's say you have a particular book you want, or maybe a particular article. You've searched the library, you've searched the databases, and you're just not finding what you need. Maybe it's because we don't have it. You now have access to a service called Interlibrary Loan. Interlibrary Loan is basically when a library does not own a particular resource, you can submit a request that goes out to all the other libraries. And one of those libraries, if they have a copy of whatever you are looking for, they might choose to let you borrow it. And honestly, more often than not, they do say yes. So what you can do is you can search for your item through our library website. And if it's an item that we don't own, you can submit an ILL request and another library will ship it to here. Or if it's a digital article, sometimes they'll just email it directly to you. It's a really handy service. I use it all the time myself and I highly recommend it. Let me walk you through the steps real quick. So going back to the library website, let me move this out of the way. Okay, so see this triple line in the top right corner? You're going to click on that. You're going to go to Services. You're going to go to Interlibrary Loan. Now, if this is your first time using Interlibrary Loan, you're going to need to create an account. It's free. You just click New User. It's going to open up this box. You're going to scroll to the bottom and click First Time Users here. Then you're going to fill out this form and submit it. Once you have submitted a form, you can begin making requests. So I'm a returning user. Let me log in real quick. Okay, I'm now in my account. So once you are logged into your Interlibrary Loan account, you're going to go back to the library website. Let's say I'm looking for a DVD of Sherlock Holmes, but I have a very particular version of Sherlock Holmes in mind. And I'm going to look over here to the left because I don't want any books. What I want is DVDs. So here on the left-hand side, I'm going to use the DVD video filter. I'm going to check mark that box. Okay, so 6 results are going to pop up. And let's say I scroll through these and I'm like, none of these are the version I am looking for. So what I am going to do to see what other options I have is I'm going to go back to this checklist. I'm going to select Libraries Worldwide. So now what it's going to do is it's going to populate the results with all the different Sherlock Holmes DVDs that are available everywhere, not just our library. So you can see we now have 5,300 results to choose from. So I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to decide on one. Maybe I decide this is the one I want. So what I would do is I would click on the title and open the record. And then on the right-hand side, we have this green button. Request item through Interlibrary Loan. You're going to click on it, and then you're going to scroll to the bottom, and you're going to click Submit Request. And once it's submitted, the request will be put out to all those libraries that own a copy of this particular DVD, and then one of them will probably decide to let you borrow it, and then they will ship it here to our library where you can pick it up. So this is a great option. Like I said, I use it all the time. I highly recommend doing this. And then you have all sorts of other online resources, of course, that aren't directly connected to the library. You've got websites like Google Scholar. The Google Scholar is really useful if you're trying to find articles. Like it uses the Google style search engine, which makes it really easy to search for stuff. The biggest problem with Google Scholar is that it rarely actually gives you access to the articles. Like it may help you find which articles you need, but you won't be able to actually read them on Google Scholar. But what you could do is you could search for the articles on Google Scholar, then you could come to the library and see if we have a copy. If we have a copy, you could read it. If we don't, you could use Interlibrary Loan to get access to it. So it's a useful resource. You also have resources like Project Gutenberg. Any text that is no longer protected by copyright, um, becomes freely available to everybody. And Project Gutenberg is a website that has dedicated itself to making those texts available to everybody for free. Now, there are way more texts out there than Project Gutenberg could possibly ever house. But if it's a classic title, a lot of times they do have a copy, so it's worth checking out. You also have various websites that you might find useful, like NEA Today or Tennessee Education Association's website. Um, the main thing to keep in mind when you are using online sources that are not databases is that you have to put more work into vetting whether or not the information is good on that website. Because again, you're not going to have all these peer reviewers doing the vetting for you. You're going to have to do some research of your own to decide whether the information is good or not. So let me give you an example, because I mean, you may have heard that if a website ends in .edu or .gov or .org, it's a more trustworthy website. Technically, that's true, but there's still some questions you should really ask yourself when reading any article online. And honestly, not just with websites, you should ask them even when you're reading these peer-reviewed articles too. It would just be a good habit to get into. You need to look at things like, well, who is writing the article? Are they a subject expert? Do they Are they the sort of person I have a reason to believe they know what they're talking about? Are they writing about something that makes sense? Do other people agree with them? Questions like that. So I'm going to show you an example of why you need to do this. So let's say you want to write a paper on whether homework is good or bad for kids. So you might go to Google and do a quick search. I just search for is homework bad for you? And then I'm going to start scrolling down and seeing what the results are. And I'm going to just say I selected this article here because it sounded kind of interesting. Why homework is bad, stress and consequences. And if I look at the top here, it tells me it is from healthline.com. So that sounds a little bit official. And it sounds like an interesting article. So I'm going to check it out. So I open the website, I read the article, and now I have to decide whether or not the information is actually any good. So the first thing I'm going to look for is who wrote this article. If you look over here to the right at the top of the article, it tells you the article was written by a Sandra Levi. So now I've got to figure out who is Sandra Levi. Is she a teacher? Is she a psychologist? What kind of person are we dealing with here? So I know that Sandra Levi wrote on Healthline, so that is what I would search for. And here she is. We have a Sandra Levi on MedCity News. And this gives me a little description about her. It's not really the kind of information I'm looking for. Like, yes, I know she writes for these different websites, but I want to know what like her education background is. So my thought is to go check out her LinkedIn page. So I went to LinkedIn and I searched for Sandra Levi and I managed to find her since she used the same photo, which was handy. And when I scroll down, I'm going to look at her experience. So we see she's got 14 experiences listed all the way back to 1980. And what I see is editor, reporter, columnist, writer. I mean, she clearly has lots of experience as a writer, but nothing is sticking out to me as anything to do with education specifically. So if I go back to her main page, now I'm going to look at her education. She's got a BA in English and writing, which makes sense. But again, that's not necessarily something in education. So that tells me Sandra Levi is basically a really good writer, but I don't necessarily know that she's an expert on education or how homework affects children psychologically. Now, maybe she's a mom, maybe she has her own children, and she's seen that homework has had a negative effect on them, and that's why she's writing about this subject. So she may have something accurate and important to say, but the weight that her information carries now doesn't seem quite as good to me. So, what I would probably do next is I would see if somebody else has written on the same subject, but who is a subject expert, somebody who would be considered a respected peer by the academic community in education. So, like I said, you really want to do your vetting when deciding whether or not the information you're finding is good or not. Now, we've talked about what kind of sources there are, and I've talked about where you can go to find sources. But now that you know where to find the sources, how do you actually find them? As you may already know, databases are notoriously difficult to use. The information on them is really, really good, but actually using them can be kind of a pain. So I'm going to teach you some tricks and tips to help make the process easier. So let's go back to the library website real quick. And I'm going to go to the education subheading. And I'm going to select ERIC from the list because I know ERIC is a really great database for education. Some of you have probably already used this, if not all of you. So when it comes to searching for anything on a database, one of the hardest parts is deciding which words to use. You have to be very selective with your keywords, and the more keywords you have, the more likely you are to actually find the information you want. Well, a lot of databases actually provide you with a thesaurus that is really, really handy. So if you look down here, under the search bars, you'll see where it says filters, search options, and subjects. So click on subjects. And right here is the search bar for the thesaurus. So let's say I want to write a paper about dyslexia in the classroom. So I'm going to type in dyslexia and see what it finds for me. So here we have dyslexia, and it gives me a small description, and then it gives me a list of related terms. So, reading difficulties, neurological impairments, learning disabilities, remedial reading. All of these suggested search terms are telling you that you can use them to search the database and it will help you to find results. So I could select dyslexia, I could select learning disabilities, I might select remedial reading, and then I would add these to my search and it fills it in for me, and then I would search. So now that I've got a bunch of results, look at this. I have 26,000 results. That's way too many. I need to filter down the results to better meet my needs, and so I don't have quite so many to go through. So if you look here at the top, you've got all these buttons to choose from. Number one, I'm going to select peer reviewed. I know my professor would want a peer reviewed article. So I check mark that. Now I've got almost 16,000 articles. I would also select full text. So full text means that the database has full access to the article rather than just a description of the article. So if you select full text, now it is narrowing down to those articles that if you click on this, it will actually take you to the article itself and you'll be able to read the whole thing. So now I've only got 5,000 results. So that's pretty good. I could also narrow it down to something that's more recently published, maybe the past 5 years. Um, and if I want to narrow it down even more, you can click on all filters and it gives you all these options that you can choose from. So I managed to get it down to under 1,000 articles. So that's definitely seems a lot more doable than the 25,000 I had to begin with. Another thing I want to point out is you see between these keywords, it's using the word or. What you are looking at here is something called a Boolean operator, and there are several of these that you can use to help with your search terms. So the three most common Boolean operators are and, or, and not. And what you do is you are using these to narrow down or expand your searches. So for example, if I were to use the and Boolean operator and search for reading difficulties and dyslexia, what it's going to do is it is only going to search for resources that use both of these terms in them. It has to have reading difficulties and dyslexia. Whereas if I am looking for articles using the or Boolean, then it's going to search for any articles that say reading difficulties and any articles that say only dyslexia, plus the articles that have both terms. So that really is going to expand your results a lot. Then you have the not Boolean operator. And so let's say I search for reading difficulties but not dyslexia. Now it is only going to pull up those articles that are about reading difficulties but not dyslexia. In addition to those Boolean operators, you have a few others. You have the quotation marks where you would, let's say you want it to be exactly worded a certain way. So maybe I wanted reading difficulties. I might put that into quotation marks so that it is going to search for that exact phrase, exactly the way I have written it, where no extra words are going to come between the two words. And it's not going to like change the spelling at all. So now it's only going to look for those articles that have that very specific phrasing in those quotation marks. You also have parentheses. These can be used to combine your operators. So here we have the example of software and engineer or architect. So what that means is it's going to bring up any articles that say software and engineer or articles that have software and architect. So you kind of get a little idea of how that works. Finally, you have the asterisk. So maybe I'm not quite sure what the best wording choice is when I say like dyslexia or reading difficulties or whatever. If you use an asterisk at to cut off the end of a word, so like instead of dyslexia, you might have it just dyslex with the asterisk at the end. Now it's going to search for dyslexia, dyslexic, and any other words that would have the beginning spelling plus anything that comes after it. So those are your Boolean operators. They're very useful. Okay, so we're moving on now. You've finally gotten to the point where you are finding the information that you want to use in your paper. You're finding stuff that seems relevant, it's useful and interesting, but now you have to determine whether or not they're really the right sources for your paper. So how do you do that? And the answer is you test them. There's four things you're going to test for. Number one is validity. Is the information accurate? Is it valid? Is it a fact or is it just the writer's opinion? Is the information current? And see, currency is one of the most important things. Not necessarily just in education, but think of it like with medicine. We are constantly updating our information about what medicine is the best treatment for certain conditions. And what procedure, like surgical procedures, are the best for dealing with certain problems. And the ones that the medicines and surgical procedures we use today are very different from the ones we used 30, 40, 50 years ago. So when doctors are looking up these articles, we don't want them looking up articles from 50 years ago. We want them looking up something a lot more recent, preferably in the last few years, so that they make sure you're getting the best treatment possible. Because I know there are certain procedures I would not want them performing anymore. And while you're not going to have something quite so life dependent in education necessarily, there are certain subjects where the currency of the information does matter, especially when we talk about child psychology. That is another subject area that is constantly updating. I think it's a little more flexible than the 5-year limit in medicine, but not by much. So you really, depending depending on what you are writing about, you really want to make sure that your information is the most up to date. In addition to testing the validity of information, you want to test the authority of it. And this is what I was talking about before when looking at the author. You want to look at who are they? What are they an expert on the subject they're writing about? What kind of experience do they have and how much? I mean, if you're talking about dyslexia, are we talking about a special education teacher who has worked with dyslexic children for decades? Are we talking about a psychologist who specializes in learning disabilities? Are we talking about a mother with a dyslexic child in the classroom? Um, all three of those viewpoints are perfectly valid for writing a paper about the topic of dyslexia, but the kind of experience they bring to it may affect how you view what they are writing, and you may put more weight on certain types of expertise than others. So that's something to look for. You might also look at what other people think of them. Sometimes you have subject experts who have had years and years of experience, but they aren't necessarily respected by their peers. They might be considered not the best people to listen to, and so that's something you may want to look for. And also, do they have an important perspective? That's important as well. The third thing you want to test for is relevance. Does this information actually apply to what you are writing about? Again, is the information current? Is the information useful? This is a big one. I mean, anybody can write anything on a topic, and it might be the most interesting thing you've ever read, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's actually useful. Um, so you want to keep that in mind. And finally, is the information saying anything new? I mean, you can have 100 people say the same thing, and you're not actually getting much out of it that you might be looking for. You want to see who is saying the newest things. And then the final thing you want to test for is sufficiency. Is the article you've selected actually enough? A lot of times, this is why you need multiple sources, because more often than not, a single source isn't going to be enough. It might have really good information that is very useful for your paper, but it won't stand alone as supporting whatever you're trying to argue in your paper. You might find articles that are on topic, but they're too broad, or they might be relevant, but they're too narrow. They may just not be thorough enough. They may kind of cover whatever you're talking about, but they don't go deep enough into the subject. And finally, the most important question of all, do they actually answer the question that you are asking? If it doesn't answer your question, it's going to have limited usefulness. Okay, so that's it for my presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. My email address and phone number for my office are here at the bottom of the screen. And of course, you are welcome to visit me in person at the library. I am happy to make appointments with you to help you with your essays. I hope to see you around. Have a great day.